Imagine being on a crowded flight, the sound of overhead announcements blending with the rustling of luggage. Now picture someone in the first-class line, dressed casually in a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing flashy. You wouldn't think much of him, right? But what if I told you that this man wasn't just anyone? This was Michael Jordan, the basketball legend, standing in line with the same calm and composed demeanor that made him a champion. Behind him, a man named Brian Thompson, dressed in an expensive suit with a smug smile plastered across his face, couldn't help but pass judgment. In his eyes, a person like Michael didn't belong in first class. Little did Brian know, this ordinary-looking man was about to teach him a lesson in humility that would change his life forever. The truth, when revealed, would leave Brian speechless. Are you ready for a story of arrogance, regret, and the ultimate revelation? This one might just make you think twice about judging a book by its cover. The calm before the storm. Michael Jordan's calm demeanor in contrast to Brian's arrogance. The airport buzzed with its usual energy, people rushing to and fro, the steady hum of conversations, and the clatter of rolling suitcases. Yet, amidst the chaos, stood Michael Jordan, as composed as ever. His presence, quiet yet undeniable, contrasted sharply with the frantic energy around him. He wore a simple hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers, comfort over extravagance. There was no designer brand screaming for attention, no flashy accessories. Just a man in the midst of an ordinary day, exuding an aura of tranquility and inner peace. What was it about Michael's stillness that seemed to set him apart? It wasn't just his clothes, but the way he moved through the world. A calm observer, unshaken by the noise. As others rushed past, anxious, distracted, or even irritated by the bustling crowd, Michael's calmness was a rare gift. Behind him, however, Brian Thompson stood in stark contrast. Dressed in a sharp, expensive suit with polished shoes that clicked loudly on the airport floor, Brian's every movement screamed confidence. To him, this was the world he had earned, a world of wealth, status, and superiority. But as his eyes scanned the line, they fell on Michael. His gaze, tinged with disdain, lingered. To Brian, Michael's unassuming appearance screamed out of place. He couldn't fathom how someone so casually dressed could even dare to be in the same line, let alone first class. It was the first sign of the judgment that would soon unfold, an arrogance born of privilege, one that often goes unchallenged in the world Brian inhabited. But Michael, despite the glances and the judgment that might have unnerved others, stood there unaffected. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't caught up in any silent battle of ego. He simply existed in that moment, unshaken, at peace. A quiet reminder that sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones who say the least. And for Brian, it was the calm before the storm. He had no idea just how much his assumptions about this ordinary man were about to be challenged. The first encounter, Brian's insults and Michael's calm response. As the first-class line inched forward, the tension between Michael Jordan's quiet demeanor and Brian's arrogance began to grow. Brian, unable to hide his condescension any longer, leaned in closer and made his first remark. His voice, dripping with sarcasm, was loud enough to ensure Michael heard every word. "First class, huh?" Brian said with a knowing smirk. "I guess anyone can get lucky these days, huh?" His words were a calculated attempt to provoke a response, a signal of his superiority. He expected Michael to either show discomfort, apologize for his presence, or at the very least, react in a way that would affirm Brian's unspoken belief that he was above this situation. Brian's eyes scanned Michael, taking in the simplicity of his clothing, the lack of extravagance. To him, this man didn't belong in a space that he reserved for those who had earned it, those who were worthy. But Michael did not flinch. His gaze turned just slightly, and the calmness in his eyes met Brian's without a hint of defensiveness. Instead of engaging in the petty confrontation Brian expected, Michael's reply was simple, yet profound. "The world is full of surprises, isn't it?" he said softly, his voice carrying an air of quiet wisdom. Brian blinked, momentarily stunned. His smirk faltered. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. The man standing before him wasn't rattled or angry. He wasn't apologizing for existing in this space. He was simply observing, as though Brian's opinion wasn't of much importance at all. Michael wasn't trying to make a statement. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply being. Brian's ego, which had been inflated by his wealth and status, was momentarily deflated. He expected a struggle, a sign of weakness that would justify his judgment. But instead, Michael's calmness made him feel small. It was as if the very essence of Michael's presence, his serenity in the face of criticism, was a challenge to everything Brian believed about success and belonging. Still, Brian wasn't ready to back down. The discomfort Michael's calm response stirred in him only pushed him to dig deeper, to find a way to make Michael feel less than. But little did he know this was just the beginning of a much larger confrontation, one where his arrogance would be met with a lesson in humility that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about worth and success. And so the stage was set for the unfolding battle, a battle not of words or status, but of perspectives on life, identity, and what truly defines a person's place in the world. Michael was about to show Brian that the real measure of a man isn't in what he wears or what he owns, but in the quiet strength of his character and his ability to remain unshaken in the face of arrogance. Settling into the flight, the unexpected seating arrangement, and Brian's growing discomfort. As the boarding process continued, the first-class passengers moved towards the plane, one by one. The sound of shoes clicking against the airport's polished floors was now replaced by the soft hum of anticipation. Michael, as calm as ever, moved forward in the line, carrying himself with the same measured pace. He didn't rush, didn't hurry to claim his space. He simply existed in the moment, unfazed by the growing crowd around him. In contrast, Brian moved with purpose, his steps firm and assured. He had spent years climbing the social ladder, and it was this sense of self-importance that had shaped every step he took. As he moved forward, he scanned the cabin for the best seat, the one that reinforced his belief that he had earned a privileged place among the elite. The first-class cabin was his kingdom, and in his mind, he was its rightful ruler. But as he walked down the aisle and checked his seat number, his confidence faltered. There, in the very seat next to his, sat Michael Jordan, the man he had dismissed in line, the man he had judged based on his clothes, his unassuming presence. Brian froze for a moment, his gaze narrowing, as if trying to process the absurdity of it all. "Are you kidding me?" Brian muttered under his breath. His mind raced with disbelief. This cannot be happening. Of all the seats in the entire cabin, why did Michael have to be sitting next to him? Brian's internal world, once so secure and unshakable, was now disrupted by the very presence of this man who he had so easily dismissed. Despite his initial shock, Brian couldn't hide his discomfort. He sat down beside Michael, but it was clear that he wasn't entirely at ease. His arms crossed defensively, his posture rigid, as though he needed to reclaim the control he felt slipping away. It wasn't just the fact that they were sitting next to each other, it was the symbolism of it all. Here he was, the man who had earned everything, now seated next to someone who didn't look the part, who didn't carry the outward trappings of success. Michael, however, seemed unaffected by the shift in the atmosphere. His gaze remained calm, almost serene. He glanced at Brian with a slight smile and said, "Looks like we're traveling together then." The words were simple, but they were enough to strip away the last vestige of Brian's illusion of superiority. The reality began to settle in. Michael Jordan wasn't just some ordinary person, nor was he here by accident. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, he simply was. And that fact, more than anything, left Brian feeling strangely exposed. As the cabin settled, Brian's discomfort grew. He had spent so much of his life fighting for recognition, fighting for status, believing that the world operated on a system of dominance and visible achievement. But now, sitting next to Michael, he began to question that belief. How could someone who had accomplished so much with nothing to prove, nothing to flaunt, make him, someone who had spent years boasting about his success, feel so small? It was as if Michael's presence alone, his quiet confidence, was a mirror reflecting the emptiness of Brian's own insecurities. Michael had not said a word, yet Brian was already starting to see that what he had long believed about success, about worth, about status, might be wrong. This moment, small as it seemed, was the beginning of a shift a shift that would eventually force Brian to reckon with the fragility of his own pride and the real meaning of success. The provocation grows, Brian's continued insults and Michael's unyielding calm. As the flight began, the hum of the plane's engines was soon accompanied by the soft clink of glassware and the polite chatter of first-class passengers. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and settling the passengers into their comfortable spaces. But for Brian, the discomfort he felt sitting next to Michael Jordan was palpable. It wasn't just the proximity to the man he had judged. It was the nagging thought that despite his wealth and status, he had no control over the situation. This, to Brian, felt like a threat, a subtle challenge to everything he had worked so hard to achieve. He couldn't let it go. The arrogance inside him burned, urging him to assert his dominance, to reassert the power he believed he deserved. Michael's peaceful composure, his quiet strength, only irritated him further. And so, as the flight attendants began their rounds, Brian made his move. "A glass of champagne, please," Brian said with a confident smile, his voice laced with an air of superiority. He wanted to ensure that everyone knew he was in control, that he was above this situation. Something that fits the occasion, something that matches the exclusivity of first class. The flight attendant, used to catering to the demands of passengers like Brian, nodded politely and moved on. But when it was Michael's turn, he simply asked for water. Brian couldn't resist. He let out a small chuckle, one laced with mockery. "Water?" he asked almost incredulously. "You're sitting in first class and you're going to drink water? Don't you want to take advantage of this? It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience and you're going to waste it?" Michael took the bottle of water with the same quiet grace he had shown all along. His expression remained serene, unaffected by Brian's attempt to provoke him. "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough," he said softly, his tone neither defensive nor apologetic. Brian narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher the response. It seemed so out of place, so unbothered, so complete. Michael's answer, so simple, cut straight to the heart of something Brian couldn't fully understand. In his world, success was something to be seen. It was about what you had, what you could flaunt, what others could admire. Michael's quiet humility, however, left him stumped. How could someone with so much, someone who had achieved everything, choose simplicity over luxury? It didn't make sense. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less," Brian shot back, a cruel edge to his voice. "Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Michael didn't respond immediately. He simply took a sip from his bottle of water, his gaze returning to the window as if contemplating the vast world outside. He didn't need to defend himself. His presence, his calm, unshakable presence, was more powerful than any words could be. But Brian, still determined to provoke him, pressed on. "Well, you know, life is like flying first class," Brian said, his voice taking on a smug tone. "You work hard for your place and then you get to enjoy it. Some people, though, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky." At this, Michael finally turned back to face him. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet firmness in his eyes that spoke volumes. "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" he said, his voice steady, almost philosophical. Brian, taken aback by the response, fell silent for a moment. It wasn't the response he had been expecting. He had hoped to provoke a visible reaction, to break Michael's calm and expose him as someone less than what he seemed, but instead he found himself at a loss. Michael's words weren't defensive, they were simply true. They made Brian uncomfortable in a way he couldn't easily explain. He had expected the world to bend to his will, to have people like Michael Jordan, with all their accolades and fame, be beneath him in some way. But Michael's ability to remain unbothered, unshaken by his provocations, was a challenge to everything Brian believed about status, success, and superiority. And for the first time, Brian realized that the words he had used to judge Michael might have been hollow. They didn't hold the weight he thought they did. Michael's response, quiet as it was, had shaken the foundation of Brian's arrogance. It was then that Brian realized that this wasn't just a confrontation. This was a confrontation of worldviews. Brian had built his identity on what he had achieved, what he could flaunt. But Michael had built his identity on something far more lasting, something that didn't need to be seen or validated by anyone else. And as the plane soared through the skies, Brian began to question whether the world he had fought so hard to climb belonged to him at all. The truth comes slowly, the growing shift in Brian's perspective. As the plane soared higher, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin began to change. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, not just because of the flight's altitude, but because of the tension that had settled in the air. Passengers around Michael and Brian began to notice the subtle exchange between the two men. Brian, still uncomfortable, was trying to regain the upper hand, but Michael's steady calmness seemed to speak louder than any words ever could. Michael had not raised his voice. He had not responded with anger or defensiveness. He had simply been, and in doing so, he had unsettled Brian in ways he hadn't expected. The more Brian tried to assert his dominance with sharp comments, the more Michael's peace revealed the emptiness in Brian's arrogance. There was a strange power in Michael's silence, a power that was slowly dismantling Brian's belief in the world as he had known it. Brian had spent his life climbing the social ladder, accumulating wealth and collecting markers of success that others could admire. He had been trained to believe that his worth was tied to his achievements, to what he could show the world. But here, next to him, sat a man who had achieved everything and more, yet wore none of the trappings of success. Michael Jordan didn't need to flaunt his status. It was already inherent in who he was. And that realization, however subtle, began to gnaw at Brian. Despite his attempts to provoke Michael further, Brian could feel the walls of his self-assurance crumbling. Michael's unshakable composure was beginning to expose the cracks in Brian's own understanding of the world. It was no longer just about the outward trappings of success. It was about something deeper, a quiet strength, an inner peace that Brian had long dismissed as irrelevant. In that moment, Brian began to realize that the things he had worked so hard for, the things he had thought defined his place in the world, were fragile. His wealth, his appearance, his success, they could all be lost in an instant. But the peace Michael displayed, the calm that came from within, was something that no amount of money or status could ever buy. It was something that wasn't dependent on external validation. Michael had not reacted to Brian's provocations because he didn't need to. He knew, on some deep level, that true worth was not measured by what one had or what one could display to the world. True worth came from how one treated others, how one carried themselves in moments of challenge, and how they remained true to their values. Brian's own words, once so sharp and certain, now seemed empty. They no longer held the weight he once believed they did. As the plane glided through the clouds, Brian found himself sinking deeper into reflection. For the first time, he questioned the foundation of his beliefs. He had built a life on the idea that success was about what you could show, what you could impress others with. But Michael's quiet strength, his lack of need to prove anything to anyone, was challenging everything Brian thought he knew. In the space of a few hours, Brian had gone from feeling secure in his superiority to wondering whether he had misunderstood the entire purpose of his pursuit. The truth had begun to slowly sink in. What truly mattered was not what you had, but how you carried yourself, how you treated others, and how you found peace with who you were. And in that moment, Michael Jordan wasn't just showing Brian the value of humility. He was showing him a new way of thinking about success, a way that didn't rely on the validation of others or the pursuit of external markers of achievement. Brian sat back in his seat, his mind swirling with questions. His entire world had just been turned upside down. The calm, humble man beside him was not just an athlete, not just a celebrity. He was a reminder of a deeper truth, one that Brian was only now starting to see clearly. Michael hadn't needed to prove anything, and in doing so, he had shown Brian what true success looked like, something far beyond the fleeting, shallow image Brian had once believed in. For the first time in years, Brian began to question his own definition of success, and he wasn't sure he liked what he saw. The final revelation, Michael's response, forces Brian to confront his own insecurities. As the flight continued, the cabin was filled with a heavy silence. The once lively conversations had quieted, and the soft clinking of glasses seemed distant. Brian, though still outwardly composed, was no longer the same man who had stepped onto the plane hours ago. The tension between him and Michael was palpable, but it was not just the contrast in their appearances or wealth. It was something deeper, something that Brian could no longer ignore. He could feel the weight of Michael's words bearing down on him. Each passing moment, each quiet smile, and each calm response from Michael seemed to highlight just how fragile the foundation of his own arrogance was. Every time Brian tried to assert control, Michael countered with the simple truth that success wasn't about what you could show or boast about. It was about how you carried yourself, how you treated others, and what you carried inside. Michael had never raised his voice, never challenged Brian's worldview directly, but with each subtle reply, he had torn down the walls of Brian's ego, revealing the insecurities hidden beneath. It was clear now, the confidence that Brian had so carefully built over the years was fragile, a veneer masking something far more vulnerable, an insecurity that came from the constant need to prove himself, to be validated by others. Michael's calm demeanor was more than just a display of humility. It was a statement that true strength comes from within. It wasn't about the suit you wore, the car you drove, or the money you could flaunt. Those things, as Brian had learned too late, were fleeting. They were external symbols of success that could disappear in an instant. What truly mattered, what made someone worthy of respect, was the character they carried within them. And as Michael leaned back in his seat, the realization began to dawn on Brian in full force. Michael wasn't here to teach him a lesson in humility. He wasn't even aware that he was showing Brian how fragile his world had become. But the quiet strength that Michael exuded was something Brian couldn't ignore any longer. He had built his life on the need to prove something to the world, to flaunt his wealth and success as proof of his worth. But Michael's simple, unbothered presence had shown him that true success was measured not by what you had, but by who you were without all of it. The words Michael had spoken earlier echoed in Brian's mind. True success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. It was the kind of statement that Brian had dismissed as idealistic, something for people who hadn't worked hard enough to earn their place. But now, with the weight of his own discomfort pressing on him, Brian began to understand the depth of those words. It wasn't idealism, it was truth. Michael hadn't needed to flaunt his success, hadn't needed to engage in any power struggles with Brian. His peace and his quiet confidence had spoken louder than any boast ever could. And in the face of Brian's continual need to prove himself, Michael's calm presence had exposed the fragility of Brian's own insecurities. The captain's voice came through the intercom, announcing that they were approaching their destination. Brian barely heard it. His mind was too preoccupied with the truth that had slowly unfolded before him. The luxury of first class, the designer suit, the arrogance, all of it seemed so hollow now. Michael, with nothing to prove and everything to offer in the way of wisdom, had shown Brian the real meaning of success, and it had nothing to do with appearances or status. As the plane began its descent, Brian finally took a deep breath. He hadn't realized how much he needed this lesson until now. His world had been built on a false understanding of worth, and Michael's quiet strength had shattered it all. In that moment, Brian understood something he had never fully grasped before. The things we seek to show the world are often the very things that hide our deepest vulnerabilities. And for the first time, Brian began to see the real value of Michael Jordan, not as a basketball legend, not as a wealthy man, but as someone who had mastered the art of being truly comfortable in his own skin. That comfort, that peace, was the kind of success Brian had been chasing all along without ever knowing what it looked like. As the plane touched down, the world outside seemed different to Brian. Quieter, less urgent, and as the passengers began to gather their things, he looked over at Michael, who was already preparing to leave the plane, unfazed by the attention he would inevitably receive once his identity was revealed. Michael's calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined Brian's own life. It was a reminder that true peace comes not from what you have, but from who you are. The revelation had come slowly, but it had struck Brian like a tidal wave, and he would never be the same again. The flight continues, the subtle shift in the cabin and Brian's growing self-awareness. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, the once lively atmosphere of first class began to feel quieter, more introspective. The hum of the engine seemed distant now, overshadowed by the subtle energy shift that had slowly crept over the cabin. What began as a confrontation between two very different men had transformed into something deeper, a quiet reckoning that was felt by everyone in the vicinity, even if they hadn't fully understood what was unfolding. Passengers who had initially been focused on their own small worlds began to notice the change in Brian. His once confident posture, so rigid and assured, had softened. His eyes, which had been sharp and calculating, now appeared distant, lost in thought. His earlier arrogance, the type that often commanded attention, seemed to fade into the background as he began to reflect on the exchange with Michael. It was as if the realization that had taken root inside him was now spreading throughout his entire being. And yet the atmosphere in the cabin was still heavy with the tension of the unspoken. The murmurs between passengers had turned into hushed whispers, their glances exchanged not just in curiosity about the two men, but in awe of how the situation was unfolding. What had started as an arrogant man's attempt to assert his dominance was slowly evolving into something much more significant. Michael's presence, his quiet, unshakable demeanor, had become the catalyst for something profound. Brian, though still outwardly composed, could no longer shake the feeling that he had lost control of the situation. Every time he glanced at Michael, his previous judgment seemed more and more misguided. He had expected Michael to engage in a battle of egos, to meet his provocations with some kind of defensiveness or challenge. But instead, Michael's calmness, his refusal to be ruffled by anything Brian said, had peeled away the layers of pretense that Brian had carefully built around himself. As the flight attendants made their rounds, Brian's eyes remained fixed on the seat in front of him, his mind racing with a new understanding. He had always believed that life was about asserting your place, about proving that you were worthy of the success you had attained. But now, sitting next to Michael Jordan, someone who had achieved everything and more, Brian began to see that there was another way to measure success. A way that didn't require validation from others or the constant need to prove yourself. The more Brian thought about it, the more he realized that his life, his career, his accomplishments, none of it had brought him the peace that Michael so effortlessly embodied. For all his wealth and status, Brian had been driven by a need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be admired. But Michael's silence, his complete lack of need to display his success, had revealed a truth that Brian had long buried within himself. True peace comes not from what you have, but from the peace you cultivate within yourself. And with that realization came a profound shift in Brian's understanding of the world. The things that once seemed so important, the displays of wealth, the signs of success, the constant race to prove himself, suddenly felt insignificant. He had spent so much time focusing on the outward signs of success that he had failed to see what really mattered: how you treat others, how you carry yourself, and most importantly, how you come to terms with who you are when the world is watching, or when it isn't. Michael had not needed to assert his dominance. He had not needed to prove that he was worthy of sitting in first class or sitting beside Brian. He had simply been, and in that quiet, unshakable presence, he had shown Brian that the true measure of success is found not in how loudly you announce your achievements, but in how quietly you embody them. For the first time, Brian felt the weight of his own vulnerability. He had always thought that success was about being the loudest voice in the room, about being the one who commanded attention. But sitting next to Michael, he saw that success could also be quiet, understated, and profound. It could be found in the way you carry yourself, in how you treat others, and in your ability to remain grounded, even in the face of judgment or provocation. And with that realization, Brian felt the first stirrings of a deeper kind of peace. It wasn't the peace that came from external validation, from admiration or applause. It was the peace that came from within, the peace that Michael Jordan had so effortlessly embodied throughout the entire flight. It was the peace of knowing that no matter how much or how little you had, you were enough. The flight continued, but for Brian the journey had already shifted. The lesson Michael had unknowingly imparted was far more important than any destination on the map. And as he sat in the quiet of first class, surrounded by passengers who had no idea of the quiet battle that had taken place beside them, Brian understood that his life was never going to be the same. The truth had been revealed, not through confrontation or argument, but through the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to prove. And in that silence, Brian had found his own moment of reckoning. The final word, Michael's last lesson in humility, and the shift in Brian's understanding. As the flight neared its destination, the soft murmur of the cabin seemed to settle into a heavy silence. The journey, which had begun with Brian's attempt to assert his dominance and Michael's calm resistance, now felt almost like a reflective pause for both men. The usual clinking of glasses and the shuffle of feet became distant sounds, overshadowed by the weight of an unspoken truth that had quietly shifted the atmosphere on the plane. Brian sat in his seat, his hands clasped together, eyes downcast. His mind raced with the lessons that had unfolded during the course of the flight. Michael's responses had been gentle, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 truths. The quiet strength with which he had carried himself, his refusal to rise to the bait of Brian's insults, had slowly peeled back the layers of Brian's pride, exposing insecurities he had long buried. There was no need for confrontation, no need to compete in a battle of egos. Michael's calm presence had done more to challenge Brian's worldview than any loud protest or sharp remark could have. And now, as the final leg of the flight approached, Brian found himself in a quiet internal battle of his own. The truths Michael had imparted, without uttering a single judgment or demand, had settled into his mind like a seed taking root. The thought that had plagued Brian since their first encounter began to grow louder in his mind. What really defines a person? In those final moments, as the plane began its descent and the lights in the cabin flickered, Michael turned to Brian. For the first time, he broke the silence between them with a soft but powerful statement. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Brian," he said, his voice calm but firm. "True success isn't about what you show the world, but how you live with yourself when no one is watching." Brian turned to face Michael, his expression softening as he processed the words. Michael had said so little over the course of the flight, yet his silence had spoken volumes. The quiet wisdom of those words seemed to fill the entire cabin, wrapping around Brian like a blanket of truth. For a moment, Brian didn't know how to respond. The words had hit him harder than any insult could have. Here he was, a man who had spent so much of his life proving himself to others, now faced with the reality that his understanding of success had been flawed all along. The things he had once sought to flaunt, his wealth, his accomplishments, his status, were no longer as important. What mattered was not how the world saw him, but how he saw himself. Michael didn't need to be flashy or loud to be a giant in his own right. He had carried the weight of his fame and accomplishments with grace, humility, and an unwavering sense of self. In that quiet space, he had shown Brian that true strength doesn't come from dominating the world around you. It comes from mastering the inner world within. Brian, for the first time in a long time, began to reflect on the meaning of his own life. He had spent years accumulating things, building a reputation, and constantly striving to prove his worth. But none of those things had given him the peace that Michael seemed to embody effortlessly. The tension that had once ruled his life began to dissolve, and in its place, there was a quiet understanding. Michael's final words echoed in Brian's mind long after the plane had touched down. True success isn't about what you show the world, but how you live with yourself when no one is watching. It was a simple statement, but it was also a profound one. In that moment, Brian understood the depth of what Michael had been trying to convey. Michael's life, his career, his legacy, had never been about proving himself to anyone. He had never needed the world's approval to know his worth. His value came from within, from the way he treated others, from the peace he found in knowing who he was, regardless of what others saw. And in the space of a few hours, Michael had shown Brian that the same could be true for him. As the flight ended and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Brian sat there for a moment longer, his mind still processing the quiet lesson he had learned. He had come onto this flight thinking he had everything figured out, but he was leaving with a new understanding of what it meant to be truly successful. The truth that Michael had so effortlessly embodied wasn't just about humility, it was about being comfortable in your own skin, without the need to prove anything to anyone. For Brian, this flight wasn't just a journey across the skies. It was a journey into his own heart, where he would carry the lessons he had learned from Michael Jordan for the rest of his life. The last word, the quiet power of Michael's presence and the unseen transformation of Brian. As the plane touched down, the familiar jolt of the landing gear hitting the runway brought the passengers back to reality. The rush to gather bags, to shuffle toward the exit, and to return to the noise of the outside world slowly resumed. But for Brian, the noise had faded. He had entered this flight consumed by his need for control, his desire to assert dominance, and a belief that success was something to be flaunted, something to be shown to the world. Yet now, after hours of quiet observation and reflection, those convictions had shattered. He glanced at Michael Jordan, who, as always, sat calmly by the window, unbothered by the commotion around him. Michael's unspoken presence had been louder than any of Brian's words, more profound than any display of arrogance. In the stillness of the flight, Michael had revealed a different kind of power. Not the power of wealth, fame, or recognition, but the power that comes from true inner peace. Michael hadn't said much, but in his silence, he had given Brian more than any conversation or confrontation ever could. Brian sat back, his mind still processing everything that had unfolded. There had been no dramatic speeches, no public humiliation, just a quiet exchange of moments, a gradual unveiling of truths he had never considered. Michael had shown him that true strength comes not from what you can display, but from how you carry yourself in the face of judgment, how you respond with grace in the face of provocation, and how you maintain your peace despite the chaos around you. The transformation wasn't immediate. It never is. But as Brian stood to disembark, he felt a shift in himself, subtle but undeniable. He was no longer the man who had boarded the flight, the man who had felt superior and entitled. The lessons Michael had imparted had not been force-fed. They had been absorbed through presence and observation. The quiet wisdom had seeped into his bones, changing his perspective without him even realizing it. Brian had come into this flight believing that power was about showing off, about proving your worth to others. He had come believing that success was defined by how much you could accumulate and how others saw you. But now he saw that true power, true success, is defined by how you live your life when no one is looking. It's the quiet way you carry yourself, the unspoken dignity you maintain, and the way you treat others when there's no applause or recognition to follow. As Michael stood up to exit, Brian caught his eye. Michael smiled briefly, but it was a smile that spoke volumes. There was no need for acknowledgement of the profound impact he had made. Michael's character was enough. He didn't need to draw attention to the change he had inspired in Brian, because the change had already happened. Michael's actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. As the passengers filed off the plane, Brian was left to reflect on the deeper lesson he had learned, a lesson that would remain with him long after the flight ended. He had been humbled, not by force, but by the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to prove. Michael Jordan's power wasn't in his titles or his fame. It was in his ability to remain true to himself, to live his life in peace and humility without needing anyone's validation. And in that, Brian had found a new definition of success, a definition that would guide him moving forward, not in the pursuit of status or recognition, but in the pursuit of peace and integrity. The flight was over, but Brian's journey was just beginning, and it was all thanks to the quiet power of Michael Jordan's presence. As we wrap up this story, we invite you to reflect on the profound lesson we've learned together. Michael Jordan's quiet strength reminds us all that true success doesn't come from what we display to the world, but from the peace we carry within ourselves. It's a reminder that the power to change, grow, and truly succeed is already within us. If you enjoyed this story and found it meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content that challenges your perspective and touches your heart. We would love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and let us know. What did this story teach you about success, humility, and personal growth? Your thoughts and reflections could inspire others too. Join our community, and let's continue this journey of self-discovery together.